In daylight, an AM station belongs to a place. Its signal follows the ground. Drive far enough and the voice frays at the edges. After sunset, the physics change. The lowest part of the ionosphere, which absorbs much of that energy during the day, fades with the light. Medium wave signals can return by skywave hundreds of miles from where they began. The darkness does not strengthen the transmitter. It enlarges the room. Someone turns a dial. Static opens and closes around half-heard stations. Then one signal settles into place. A man in the Nevada desert sounds close enough to be sitting at the other end of the table. On the 2nd of September 1997, one opening began.
From the high desert and the great American Southwest.
The wording shifted across the years. The geography remained. This was Coast to Coast AM. Its subjects included strange lights, government secrecy, remote viewing, prophecy, science, and grief. Some stories were sincere, some were commercial. Some were impossible to test. A few were false. The program's deepest effect came from the hour, the distance, and a host who left the line open long enough for a stranger to finish. This is a film about that line, the man who held it, the people awake on the other end, and the brief nightly country they made while America slept. Pahrump, Nevada, sits in open desert. The sky there has room to become an event. At night, the dark begins close to the ground and keeps going. For years, Art Bell broadcast from a studio he built at his home in Pahrump. The national program did not arrive from a glass building in New York or Los Angeles. It came from a room on an isolated property in the Nevada desert. That location became part of the meaning of the show. Bell was physically outside the system whose rejected stories he gathered. The distance was real, then turned into theater by the opening line, the midnight hour, and the patient pace of the calls. The early chronology is less tidy than the mythology. Different accounts give different years for the earlier program, the change of title, and the move toward national syndication. This film will not repair that uncertainty with a convenient date. By the late 80s, the shape was becoming recognizable. A night program, a host with technical control of his own room, and a signal that traveled much farther after dark. The uncertainty matters because legends often acquire a perfect first day. Radio rarely does. A slot changes, a station changes, a title settles, an audience grows. What feels inevitable later was usually assembled one night at a time. Bell reached that room through a working life in radio rather than through a single act of invention. He had served as an Air Force medic in Vietnam. After his Air Force service, Bell worked as a disc jockey at the English-language station KSBK on Okinawa and once stayed on air for more than 100 hours. He studied engineering, worked at small stations in different parts of the country, and spent time in Las Vegas installing cable before returning to the microphone in a night slot. The colorful versions of this biography tend to grow brighter in repetition. The reliable shape is enough. Bell understood radio as both performance and machinery. He knew what a transmitter could do, how a board felt under the hands, what silence sounded like in headphones, and how quickly a caller's courage could disappear if the host rushed to fill it. That combination made him unusual. He was a showman who preferred control of the equipment to the insulation of a production staff. The room could be theatrical without becoming crowded. A voice, a clock, a bank of telephone lines, and the dark outside were sufficient. The program would eventually contain enormous ideas: life elsewhere, secret technologies, the end of the world, what waits after death. Its physical origin remained modest. One man sat at a desk and decided which blinking line to open. The equipment gave Bell control. His temperament decided what to do with it. He selected callers himself. Contemporary profiles describe calls arriving without a producer first approving the story. The system still had rules and structure. There were themed lines, regional lines, a line for first-time callers, and versions of a wildcard line. The names changed. The principle held. The person who answered the call was the person the caller had come to speak with. This created risk. A professional screener protects a program from dead air, repetition, obscenity, confusion, and people who have no idea how to begin. Bell accepted more of that uncertainty than most national hosts would tolerate. In return, he received something polished radio often loses: the moment before a person knows how to tell the story.
You can hear that moment even when you cannot hear the old broadcast. It is the pause at the start of a difficult call. The caller has passed through. The famous voice is there. A private experience now has a national audience. For a second, the entire program rests on whether the host will hurry, ridicule, rescue, or wait.
Bell was good at waiting. He could be skeptical, he could interrupt, he could become impatient. The memory of the program has sanded away some of those edges. What survived in profile after profile is the more important pattern. People believed they could speak in his room without being openly humiliated. From the outside, the arrangement was almost absurdly small. A continent of dark roads and wakeful rooms narrowed to one lit window in Pahrump. Inside, Bell listened to people describe things they could not safely say at work, at church, at dinner, or sometimes even to the person sleeping in the next room. The paranormal supplied a vocabulary. Beneath it were recognizable human pressures: fear, bereavement, wonder, suspicion, loneliness, the wish to be chosen by the universe, the dread that nobody would believe what had happened. Bell did not need to settle those pressures in order to hold them. Radio had an advantage that television rarely grants. Nothing had to be shown. A caller did not have to look credible. The desert did not need to appear behind the host. The listener built the room from a voice and a little static. This freedom also concealed things. A voice can sound certain without being honest. A story can become stronger when no image has to support it. The same darkness that made intimacy possible made verification difficult. For a while, Bell sat at the boundary between the comfort of being heard and the risk of believing too quickly. Open lines were not an absence of design. They were a design built around chance. At different points, there were lines for callers east of the Rockies, west of the Rockies, outside the United States, and calling for the first time. There was a wildcard line. Some nights added categories so specific they became part of the show's humor and ceremony. The lines organized access without asking a producer to decide which story was good enough for air. Geography, persistence, and luck did much of the choosing. That changed the emotional contract. A caller did not first sell a premise to someone off mic. The first real encounter could happen in public. Bell might find a remarkable story. He might find confusion. Often he found a person who needed a few seconds to understand that the waiting was over. The program allowed those seconds. Modern media is trained to remove them. The pause is cut. The uncertain opening is replaced by the clean sentence that came later. Coast to Coast frequently left the seam visible. The listener heard a stranger become a broadcaster in real time. That was part of the suspense. It was also part of the kindness.
Watch the day go by. Across the table, over painted miles, we let the light become our lullaby. Ooh, coral warmth against the deep indigo. The shadows have a color of their own. We stand within the amber of the afterglow, finding peace in everything we've known. Coral heat and indigo blue. Coral heat, everything new. Everything.
The interviews were built from the same resource, time. On a documented night in November 1998, the program ran for more than 3 hours. One guest occupied almost 2 of them before the next conversation began. There was no opposing panel waiting for equal time, no visual package counting down, no demand that the subject become simple before the next break. Length did not make every guest truthful. It made evasion easier to hear.
A strange idea held for 90 minutes changes character. Sometimes it deepens, Sometimes its internal weaknesses begin to repeat. The host and audience have time to notice both. The format could create seriousness around material that had not earned it, yet it could also reveal a person more fully than a 5-minute confrontation would have done.
Bell understood that a late-night listener experiences duration differently. A driver has road remaining, a nurse has hours left in the shift, an insomniac is not trying to arrive quickly at the morning. The program did not have to respect the daytime fear of taking too long. It could inhabit the hour instead.
The shadows have a color of their own. We stand within the amber of the afterglow, finding peace, in everything we've known. No one poses and no one smiles. We turn away to watch the day go by. Across the table, over painted miles, we let the light become our lullaby. Ooh, coral warmth against the deep indigo. The shadows have a color of their own.
Repetition turned the program into a place. The opening located it. The named lines gave it doors. Seasonal traditions returned like rooms that were only unlocked once a year. At Halloween, Ghost to Ghost AM invited listeners to tell personal stories. The value of those nights was less in the evidence than in the form. One person spoke, a host listened. Somewhere beyond both of them, an unseen audience decided whether to believe, doubt, or simply stay until the end. Every durable broadcast develops liturgy. A theme arrives, a phrase returns, a voice uses the same path into the evening. The familiar structure tells the listener that the room still exists. That matters at night. Daytime companionship can be accidental. Traffic, colleagues, a shop, a neighbor in the street. After midnight, companionship usually has to be chosen and switched on. For the coast-to-coast audience, ritual made that switch immediate. Static, the opening music, the voice from the high desert, and a solitary room joined something larger.
The sun has found the corners of the room. The work is finished and the tools are still. A cooling mug, a shadow on the wall. The light is bending to the evening's will. Ooh, coral warmth against the deep indigo. The shadows have a color of their own. We stand within the amber of the afterglow, finding peace, in everything we've known. No one poses.
Imagine the structure without inventing the person. A telephone is off its cradle. The radio is low enough to avoid feeding back through the line. The caller hears the program twice, once from the set in the room, arriving a beat behind after its journey through the network, and once through the narrow telephone sound in the ear. There may be a truck parked beyond the reach of city light. There may be a kitchen table with one cup on it. There may be a quiet desk in a building that will not fill again until morning. We know those kinds of places belong to the audience. We do not give their occupants names they never gave us. The line advances. Then the host answers. For the next few minutes, the caller's account becomes the center of a national program. The change in scale is difficult to overstate. A private memory, perhaps carried for years, is suddenly held by strangers from one coast to the other. Some callers used that opening well. Some performed. Some frightened themselves. Some may have been lying. The host could not know in advance, and neither could the audience. The uncertainty was the engine. The attention was the gift.
The work is done. The room is quiet now. The sun has found the corners of the room. The work is finished and the tools are still. A cooling mug, a shadow on the wall. The light is bending to the evening's will.
The program's contract was simple enough to feel radical.
You may tell the story. You will have time. You will not be laughed out of the room before you have finished.
That contract says nothing about whether the story is true. Bell's great strength was his ability to separate hearing a person from immediately accepting the account. His weakness was that airtime itself carries authority. However often a host declares neutrality, a national microphone can make hospitality sound like endorsement. For years, the program lived inside that unresolved space. It was generous and dangerous for the same reason. The door stayed open. The best nights used openness to discover a human being. The worst allowed a claim to borrow the dignity of the listening offered to the person making it. That distinction becomes harder as the stories grow more famous. And some nights became famous enough to outlive almost everything around them.
Shadows have a color of their own. We stand within the amber of the afterglow, finding peace in everything we've known. Coral heat and indigo blue. Coral heat, everything new. Everything old is becoming new. The work is done. The room is quiet now.
Certain broadcasts survived because they seemed to contain the whole program in miniature. There were warm nights, full of short stories and familiar ritual. There were long interviews in which a strange idea became an environment. There were calls whose fear changed the room before anyone could decide what had happened. These moments are often collected as evidence for or against the paranormal. That is not their purpose here. They show the relationship between host, caller, and audience under pressure. What happens when an open line receives terror? What happens when a photograph moves faster than the correction? What happens when a program built on suspended judgment meets a consequence that cannot be suspended? The famous nights are useful because they expose the cost of the contract. They also expose the way memory improves a story. Ambiguity is trimmed. Dates settle into the wrong places. A claim repeated across many fan pages begins to look independently confirmed, even when every page is repeating the same uncertain source. The closer we come to the mythology, the more carefully the dates and versions have to remain apart. On the 11th of September 1997, an open lines program invited calls from people who said they had worked at Area 51. One caller sounded terrified. The substance of the call has been replayed and retold for years. A distressed man spoke of hidden knowledge and danger. During the exchange, the program's transmission was interrupted. In the network's account of the 11th of September broadcast, an engineer said the satellite carrying the show seemed to have lost its Earth sensor lock. Bell switched to a backup system. A separate network listing dated the 27th of November later called the interruption a mysterious outage. Later retellings made the interruption itself part of the evidence, as though the signal had been stopped by whatever the caller feared. An outage proves an outage. The fear was still real as a broadcast event. Bell and his audience did not have the finished legend in front of them. They had a voice, a claim, and then an absence where the program had been. That is enough to explain why the moment remained. Radio had turned invisible infrastructure into drama. The line cut, and everyone listening had to decide what the silence meant. The story later acquired two incompatible endings. In that the 27th of November network listing, the caller was said to have returned and to have said he was being guarded while he spoke. In another later version, a caller claimed that the original call had been a performance. The best-known identification rests on a later self-claim rather than contemporary independent reporting. The familiar hoax ending is not established by the contemporary independent reporting located for this film. It may have been a hoax. That possibility belongs in the film. Certainty does not. The disagreement is more revealing than a clean verdict. The network version preserves threat. The later performance self-claim supplies relief. It invites the call to be heard as crafted radio. Neither ending independently identifies the original caller. Bell's original audience had neither ending that night. They heard a frightened voice and then lost the signal.
Memory wants to close the line. The broadcast left it open.
The Area 51 call endures because the event and the explanation have never fully become the same thing. A confirmed hoax would let the audience admire the craft. A confirmed threat would turn the interruption into evidence. The surviving record offers neither comfort cleanly. Radio is especially powerful in that gap. The listener cannot inspect the room around the caller, study a face, or see what happened when the line went dead. The mind supplies what the medium withholds. Fear enters through absence. Bell knew how to remain with that absence. Sometimes he challenged a caller. Sometimes he let the audience hear his own uncertainty. The program did not need a final answer before the next person called. That quality made extraordinary nights feel alive. It also allowed later retellings to harden around whatever answer their community preferred. The lesson is smaller than the legend and more useful. A feeling can be real inside an event whose explanation remains unresolved. The fear in the room does not prove the story. Discovering that a story may be false does not erase what happened between the people who heard it together.
This film will keep those facts apart.
The program was often careless about the distance between feeling and proof. Its listeners were not foolish for feeling what live radio was built to make them feel. The strongest chapter in this story has the thinnest record. We know the kinds of people who listened. Long-haul drivers carried the show across empty miles. Night workers found it during hours organized around other people's sleep. Insomniacs and people living far from the centers of things used the program as company. Published recollections and reporting support the pattern. What we do not have is permission to turn that pattern into a cast. There is no representative nurse whose private grief we may invent, no driver whose marriage can be repaired for the convenience of a chapter, no lonely widower waiting in a kitchen unless a real person has offered that story under his own name. So the listener appears first as a place. A fluorescent corridor with the lights reduced, a dashboard moving through Wyoming or Ohio, a bakery before the front door opens, a modest kitchen where a radio occupies the part of the table another person might have occupied.
These places are not evidence about one life. They are the architecture of wakefulness.
The show entered them without asking why the lamp was still on. Truckers remember Bell as a voice of the night. The fit was physical before it was cultural. The driver crossed distance while the signal crossed distance. The program could fade near one town and return after the road rose. An AM voice was not a file carried intact in the cab. It was something found again in the dark. That fragility gave the listening weight. The audience had to be present at the hour the program was present. Miss the call, and the moment belonged to those who had stayed awake. Recordings later removed that condition. They preserved the voice, the callers, the strange pacing, and the long silences. They made it possible to hear the show on another night, in another country, years after the room in Pahrump went dark. Some listeners say they still use those recordings for sleep. The choice makes sense. The subject may be alarming, yet the structure is reassuring. A calm voice holds the line. Another person is awake. The night has a shape and will be carried for a while without you. The official archive preserves a listing for the night of 9 to 11, hosted by Art Bell on Tuesday, the 11th of September 2001. The listing says Bell opened the lines that evening. That fact matters because a program built for extraordinary claims suddenly met a day whose reality required no enlargement. The audience came to the same room carrying shock, confusion, and the knowledge that the ordinary world had changed while they were watching it. We do not need to reconstruct those calls to understand the function of the night. Live radio gave people a common hour in which to speak and listen before the event had settled into history, policy, or repeated footage. The program's community was never only a collection of paranormal interests. It was a group gathered by simultaneity. On the 11th of September, that structure became visible. The subject changed completely. The need for a human voice in the dark did not. Broadcast companionship contains a fact that on-demand listening cannot reproduce. During a live broadcast, listeners heard each moment unfold together.
The driver does not know the nurse. The person in the kitchen will never meet the security guard. Each may believe the room is solitary. The program joins them at the level of time.
That knowledge can be almost unconscious. A caller hesitates and unknown listeners remain with the same pause. A joke lands across distant rooms. The signal disappears and the silence is shared. The audience remains invisible, but it is present. An open microphone has consequences beyond the relationship between host and caller. A claim can leave the room. It can acquire photographs, advocates, critics, and commercial value. It can enter another community whose members never heard the host's caution. Only the story after repetition had made it simpler. The hardest example in the Art Bell record concerns Comet Hale-Bopp and the 39 members of Heaven's Gate who died in California in March 1997. The sequence has often been compressed into one sentence: a photograph, a radio program, a belief, a mass suicide. The compression creates a causal story the record cannot support. The details have to be slowed down and kept separate. Two different images became tangled in the retelling. The first was made by an amateur astronomer on the 14th of November 1996. Astronomers identified the apparent companion as the background star SAO 141894. The imaging setup made it look unusual. The second image appeared online, including on the host's own website. Astronomer David Tholen said it had been fraudulently altered from his own telescope image, made on the 1st of September 1995. In January 1997, he wrote that the supposed companion had most likely been added through digital image processing. One image showed a real background star whose appearance was made unusual by the imaging setup. The other was, according to the astronomer whose source image had been used, a digital fabrication. Merging them gives the story one neat false photograph. Keeping them apart shows how uncertainty actually spreads. Observation, error, copying, manipulation, and repetition do not arrive wearing the same clothes. The distinction is technical. It is also moral. If a film cannot keep two images apart, it has no standing to accuse a radio program of keeping fact and possibility too close together. On the 26th of March 1997, 39 members of Heaven's Gate were found dead at a house in Rancho Santa Fe, California. They had died over several days. The group believed that a craft traveling behind Hale-Bopp would carry them to what they called a higher level. Those facts are established. The claim that Bell's broadcast caused the deaths is not. The program had given airtime to the companion object story. Bell later rejected the causal accusation and said he had challenged one of the disputed photographs on air. Critics argued that national exposure had helped the belief travel. The record supports responsibility as a question. It does not support a line drawn cleanly from one broadcast to 39 deaths. There is no honest arithmetic for how much one microphone contributed to a closed belief system already moving toward catastrophe. Declaring Bell the cause would turn uncertainty into accusation. Declaring the program irrelevant would turn uncertainty into absolution. The discomfort remains because both easy answers ask the evidence to carry more than it can. Hospitality toward the unproven has a boundary, even when nobody can mark its exact location in advance. Bell's defense was that he gave people room to speak and allowed listeners to decide. The criticism is that a national platform changes a claim simply by placing it on the platform. Airtime supplies seriousness. Repetition supplies familiarity. A host's neutrality may sound like permission when the guest is selling certainty. The audience was not a passive mass. Listeners doubted, argued, laughed, and changed stations. Treating them as helpless is another form of contempt. Still, the microphone belonged to Bell. That is where the line returns. Curiosity is a virtue, so is the willingness to say that a story has outrun its evidence. The program's generosity and its irresponsibility were often the same habit viewed from different distances. One human host could sometimes hear the moment a call became cruel, dangerous, or empty. He did not always hear it. No format could guarantee that he would. The program did not cause the internet that followed it. It revealed an appetite the internet would learn to serve without sleep, local signal limits, or a host at the center. Stories outside mainstream permission found an audience. That audience valued attention without ridicule. Online systems preserved the attention and removed much of the friction. No one had to hear uncertainty in a caller's breath. No host had to decide whether the next line should open. A recommendation could lead directly from curiosity to certainty, and then to a community organized around certainty. Bell's room had flaws. It still had a room. A person occupied the threshold. Keeping that threshold open carried a personal cost as well. Bell's departures were sometimes abrupt. Later projects were shadowed by reported threats and intrusions at his property. The details belonged to his private life. The pattern is enough. A career built on being reachable made retreat difficult. The open door had never been only a metaphor. Art Bell left and returned more than once. The reasons changed. Personal and family crises and later reported threats entered the public explanations at different moments. Temporary departures became part of the rhythm around the program, though later summaries disagree about how to count them. Counting is less important than the pattern. The show depended on a presence that could not be replaced merely by keeping the frequency occupied. Bell could step away, and the format remained. When he returned, listeners recognized that the room had changed back. This is the problem every program built around one voice eventually faces. The institution wants continuity. The audience has attached continuity to a person. Coast to Coast had become larger than its original host. It had not become independent of him. The official archive gives the transition a title and a date. Art's Farewell New Year's Eve Show, the 31st of December 2002. George Noory's first working day as permanent host followed on the 1st of January 2003. A change at midnight suited a program that had made midnight its territory. 1 year ended. One host left the central chair. The signal continued. Noory brought a different temperament. The program survived, with weekday and weekend hosts carrying the format into another era. Guests still arrived with claims from the edges of accepted knowledge. Listeners still called from rooms the rest of the country could not see. Survival proved that the structure was durable. The way people continued to search for Bell's recordings proved something else. A format can endure while a particular quality of attention remains irreplaceable. Coast to Coast AM continues. Its longevity is easy to explain at the level of subject. The unexplained does not run out. New technologies create new mysteries. Old fears find new names. Every generation discovers that official knowledge leaves parts of life unanswered. The harder continuity lies in the hour. There are still people driving, working, grieving and waiting for sleep after midnight. There are more ways to reach them than Bell ever had. Few create the same sense that everyone has entered one room together.
The official Art Bell Vault preserves selected programs. Unofficial copies and long compilations circulate elsewhere. Some listeners choose them for the subject, others choose them because the pacing itself has become a form of rest.
The old broadcast returns as an on-demand object. It sounds the same. The conditions around it have changed. Art Bell died on the 13th of April 2018, aged 72, at his home in Pahrump, Nevada. The room that had once made the desert sound close to an entire country was silent. His recordings continued to cross the distance. Death gives an archive a boundary. There will be no unexpected return, no new night added to the shelf. The voice belongs to finished time. Yet a recording resists that knowledge for a while. Press play after midnight and Bell is again selecting a line, greeting a guest, allowing a silence that modern editing would remove. The program behaves as though the night is still happening. That illusion is part of its comfort. It is also where the loss becomes clear. Some listeners say they still put on Art Bell recordings to fall asleep. The choice contains a gentle contradiction. They return to accounts of intruders, secret bases, strange lights, and approaching catastrophe because the person holding those stories sounds calm enough to rest beside. The recording gives the voice back perfectly enough. It gives back the static, the openings, the callers, and the duration. It gives back the sensation that a long night has somewhere to go. What it cannot restore is the audience as a present fact. The listener today may know that others love the same recording. They are not waiting through the same pause at the same second. The community has become a collection of private returns. The voice survives. The shared hour does not. We assumed the comfort was the voice. It was the others. The truck beyond the next ridge, the nurse under fluorescent light, the person at a kitchen table in a town whose name would never be spoken on air. None could see the rest. For a few hours, each knew the rest were there. Live radio joined loneliness to time. It did not cure the night. It made the night common. A recording can keep a voice from vanishing. It cannot make the unknown listener hear it now. The road continues beneath a larger sky. One window remains lit, then another, too far away to see it. For a moment, the dial is quiet.